Welcome to Senadivan Education Foundation. The only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing. So we started this knowledge sharing platform way back in 2007 by releasing the brochure of an educational program by Antonio Longo from Italy, who is the founder of stapler hemorrhoidectomy. In 2012 June, we launched the Senadivan Education Foundation by releasing a set of education DVDs, and it was released by Professor Sion Han Kim from Korea at Taj Vivanda, Trivandrum. Then we started having 6 months and 1 year fellowship program, free fellowship programs in laparoscopy, both in basic and advanced laparoscopy procedures. We used to have contact classes and give hands-on training. With the advent of COVID, we transformed the platform to online platform, and the logo was released by Professor Palanivelu in July. Then we started having live surgeries in online platform. We did the first live surgery in Facebook Live. That was a live lab AR. Then we started other programs, and we did a lab people live in YouTube, and link was shared to the members of Senadivan Education Foundation. Then we started having live lectures with world leaders. We have appearance in social media. We have 15 WhatsApp groups and one Facebook group having more than 900 members. In the season 1, we had 28 webinars with world leaders like Dr. Leroy, Dr. H.RAMESH, and others. Actually, in the first season, Dr. H.RAMESH gave a talk on surgical strategy for pancreatic cancer that was well received by the viewers. We have got global acceptance. Actually, more than 50 countries participate in each webinar. On our webinars, you can see the participant number is 1,303. And we have got a YouTube channel, and all the webinar videos are available free for free view in the YouTube channel of Senadivan Education Foundation. Today we have two eminent figures, Dr. H.RAMESH, who is a well-known figure in the field of pancreas internationally, and also Dr. PRADEEP RABELLA. Dr. PRADEEP RABELLA is a senior surgical gastroenterologist in the Asian Institute of Gastroenterology, Hyderabad, India. He is personally the president of Indian Association of Surgical Gastroenterology. He is a fine surgeon. He is soft-spoken. He has been examined for many years for DNB exams for surgical gastroenterology, has many publications, and he has got keen interest in pancreatic surgery. Dr. H.RAMESH is the director of VPS Lakeshore Hospital, Cochin, India. He has got more than 30 years of experience in pancreatic surgeries. He has got more than 100 publications in index journals, and he has contributed to more than 13 book chapters. He has performed the first lab colleague in my state, that is Kerala, India, and he has been conferred with FRCS in 2006 and FACS in 1996. He has got a Young Clinician Award from World Congress and Young Surgeons Award from Japanese Society of Surgery, and he has done many prestigious orations. Dr. H.R. is a great thinker with great ideas. He is a philosopher. He is a surgeon par excellence. He is academician to the core. To me, he is an advisor, like an elder brother. And more than that, he speaks more than 10 languages. You must have heard that he is speaking Telugu with Dr. PRADEEP RABELLA. Before handing over the mic to Dr. PRADEEP RABELLA, I request all the participants to mute their mic on entry. If possible, kindly acknowledge by renaming your device by yours. Participants logging from outside India are requested to reveal their identity in the chat box. Raise your hand if you want to intervene. Everybody will be given permission to unmute their mic if they want to speak. If you are on a portable device, please mute your audio and hide your video. You can contact us in sanarbin@gmail.com. Thank you all for participation and handing over the mic to Professor Pradeep Rabella for the proceedings.
Thank you, Baiju, for an excellent work you have been doing, and it's going to be very beneficial for the students. And I think you have already introduced H.RAMESH. He doesn't require any introduction. He's a well-known figure in the field of pancreatic surgery, and I know him for more than 30 years now from my resident days. And if you talk of chronic calcific pancreatitis, the only name comes from India would be H.RAMESH. So he has so many publications to his credit, and I think now may I request Dr. H.RAMESH to speak on overview of chronic calcific pancreatitis. Dr. Ramesh, all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Pradeep, and good evening, everyone. I first wish to commend Baiju for his commitment, enthusiasm in continuing to educate all of us by bringing so many key speakers to our forum, which would be well beyond the reach of many of us. And it's been a consistently high-level effort, and I wish him all the best so that he may continue this process. Dr. Pradeep and I did our residency in the PGI together, and so apart from being GI surgeons, we also share a close family bond. The talk is chronic calcifying pancreatitis. That's, I believe, the term rather than chronic calcific pancreatitis. And I'm going to give a kind of a different type of talk. I'm afraid that, I have been such a frequent speaker that at this subject, that there have been two somewhat unjustified conclusions drawn. A, that I know little else, and B, that I might tend to repeat myself. And if I repeat myself, it's only because I need to emphasize certain points. So I wish to start with the history. And in 1946, and I'm not sure if anybody in the audience or in the panel was alive at this time, where Comfort and Gamble described the clinical features of chronic pancreatitis in a study of 29 cases. And we've come a long way from there, but we still haven't gotten a long way because there are so many mountains to climb even now. If we had to diagnose chronic pancreatitis, we need some criteria. We can use calculi, provided you can rule out dystrophic calcification of a pseudocystoid tumor or a metastatic calcification of hyperparathyroidism. If you have main duct or side branch changes on imaging, say CT, MR, ERCP, MRCP, that's good. And if you have EUS criteria, that is the Rosemont criteria, as you're aware, you can conclude that you have chronic pancreatitis. But if you have to be certain, you have more or less, you would be diagnosing advanced disease, and that's what we are dealing with at this time. We must realize that acalculous disease does exist, and many ducts may be normal sized, and both these are absolutely true in practice. Henri Saul from Marseille in France described chronic calcifying pancreatitis as a separate entity against obstructive pancreatitis, autoimmune pancreatitis, and group pancreatitis, and each one has its own importance. I'm going to concentrate on chronic calcifying pancreatitis. This has been associated with alcohol, smoking, genetic factors, and of course the idiopathic tropical pancreatitis of India has been a hot subject. Many researchers have felt that by talking about tropical pancreatitis, they would jeopardize their chance of being noticed on the big stage, because Western observers, researchers may simply dismiss the information as dealing with a different disease, and they've chosen to call it idiopathic, either juvenile onset or senile onset. And really, we don't for sure know that it's a senile onset pancreatitis. And there are many, many lacunae there, which I shall not go into at this time. histology is probably the best way to diagnose chronic pancreatitis, but it's not available in most situations. And you don't get slides like these with the whorls of connective tissue around atrophic glands, atrophic acinar glands. Or this is not a common picture. And this is the typical picture of autoimmune pancreatitis with lymphoplasmacytic infiltration. It just be improper on my part to dwell on autoimmune pancreatitis because that's a large subject in itself. But suffice it to say that we have a type 1 and a type 2 disease. The type 2 disease is even more difficult to differentiate from cancer. And that is the big problem. So it's a big masquerader. We have two problems here. One is that the autoimmune pancreatitis, which is regarded as cancer and undergoes an unnecessary resection. But in India, the bigger problem seems to be that you have pancreatic cancer, which is mistakenly diagnosed as autoimmune pancreatitis. The patient is placed on steroids. Resultant drop in bilirubin is a further lulls the clinician into a sense of, a complacency. And pretty soon the cancer has metastasized. And this is something that we have seen more than once. So I'm going to concentrate on chronic calcifying pancreatitis. But I need to just mention that chronic obstructive pancreatitis, considering that chronic pancreatitis is an irreversible condition, a progressive condition, this is a reversible condition. When there is a obstruction to the duct due to a pseudocyst, a stricture, a stone, then you can have a situation where there is little or no calculi, little or no fibrosis, and little or no functional deficiency. And this condition should be recognized and treated energetically and promptly, because complete recovery of the pancreatic function can be expected. Of course, we have alcohol abuse and idiopathic causes as the biggest problems in our society here. And I just wish to dwell on the genetic issues that have really troubled our researcher in chronic pancreatitis. We know that certain genes have been associated, mutations in certain genes have been associated with chronic pancreatitis. The cationic trypsinogen gene, which is really very commonly seen in hereditary pancreatitis. The serum protease inhibitor, the SPINK1, which is actually a trypsin inhibitor, and its mutation allows the trypsin to get activated, and that causes pancreatitis. And several other genes have also been implicated. The stellate cell in the pancreas is at the epicenter of the fibrosis pathway. It is believed that whatever happens, it leads to stellate cell activation, and there is a whole lot of processes which lead to stellate cell activation. In fact, our unit did a pathological study on stellate cell activation in tropical calcific pancreatitis and found that the highest activation happened in tropical pancreatitis and adenocarcinoma of the pancreas. There are so many genes now, which are 7 of them, which are now being implicated in the pathogenesis of chronic pancreatitis. What is the cause of chronic pancreatitis, especially the idiopathic non-alcoholic variety? It appears that this is the Swapna Mahurkar two-hit hypothesis, which was published over 10, 12 years ago, but it still does not answer all the questions. It appears that there is a supertrypsin which digests its own organ, but how it forms and whether it's a genetic combined with environmental or hereditary factors is not clear. We must also remember that planned pancreatic parenchymal fibrosis also is not uncommon at autopsy. So fibrosis itself need not be a disease. And we think that the stellate cell activation produces fibrosis, and that may not be all the whole story. Let's just forget all this and think about what Lord Moynihan said over 120 years ago, that in pancreatitis, he wanted us to alleviate pain, nausea, and emesis, as well as the prevention of pancreatic atrophy. And they can still remain the goals today: symptom relief and function preservation. And if you can achieve these two, you have given the patient a good quality of life, especially considering that this is a disease which affects young men and women in the prime of their lives. There are many classifications, and they testify to the lack of efficacy of any single classification. I have one somewhere which I will be discussing further. The Mannheim classification is the one maximally used in Northwestern Europe. So if you have to further, in addition to symptom relief and function preservation, you want to look at the morphology of the gland. You can have large ducts, as you can see here. You can have narrow ducts, as you can see here, ducts which are less than a fourth of the diameter of the ERCP scope, so about 2.5 millimeters. In fact, there is a leak into the pancreatic pleural effusion on the body of the pancreas as well. And there can be a pancreatic mass lesion, which can be either benign or malignant. So if I had to sum up the approach to large duct disease, you could use endoscopy or surgery. For small duct disease, endoscopy is not very efficacious and surgery would be required, if at all. And many people believe that resection surgery is required, and I shall try to dispel that idea. Mass lesions, after confirming or ruling out cancer, you would need a surgical procedure by and large. The big conundrum in chronic pancreatitis further is that there is no correlation between symptoms, morphology, and functional status. On the one hand, you can have an asymptomatic patient with a dilated pancreatic duct without diabetes or steatorrhea and an atrophic gland, but for some reason, there is enough pancreatic reserve to keep the patient euglycemic and without steatorrhea. There can be the other patient with a slightly inflamed gland with a narrow duct who has got absolutely excruciating pain unrelieved by narcotic analgesics. And that patient may or may not have functional deficiency. It is also not clear whether the functional deficiency is pre-existing. For example, Kerala and India are the diabetic capitals of the country and the world respectively. And these patients have the propensity to get diabetes mellitus even without the development of chronic pancreatitis. So I tend to follow in our unit the ABC system, which was published in 2003. A being asymptomatic, B being pain without complication, and C complication present. Pain may or may not be present. Some of the complications are painful, like pseudocyst, abscess, inflammatory head mass, or pancreatic ascites and pleural effusion, whereas some others are not painful or are not really painful. Each of these groups is divided into 0, 1, 2, or 3, depending on whether they have functional deficiency or not. If they have 1, it means they have diabetes only. If they have 2, they have steatorrhea only. And if they have 3, they have steatorrhea and diabetes. This also allows us to study the natural history of the disease, something that has not been studied completely, thoroughly thus far. So if you have, for example, a patient who has A0 and neither has functional deficiency nor pain, and if you follow that patient up for 5 years or more, or 10 years or whatever, you have the possibility of finding out or determining what's going to happen to these patients over a period of time. Who would merit intervention in the B and the C group? Obviously, either those who have intractable pain, those who have complications, or those who have suspected or proven malignancy. A word about the patient who is asymptomatic or who does not have pain. One would, at this moment, treat steatorrhea and diabetes if present. If there is a modifiable risk factor like smoking or alcohol, they would be counseled and assisted to try and kick the habit. You could follow up and screen with all these patients, screen relatives, because this has been known to occur in families. Whether or not endotherapy or surgery is appropriate in this situation is still a matter of controversy. I think the general consensus is that we would not institute any intervention at this point. The diabetes mellitus in chronic pancreatitis is type 3C diabetes. It is not type 1 or type 2. It is similar to type 1 because it is insulin dependent, but it's different because of the involvement of the alpha cells. Therefore, there's less glucagon, and that increases the risk of hypoglycemia because glucagon is the one which keeps the blood sugars up. But the patients with T3C diabetes never develop or rarely develop diabetic ketoacidosis because the beta cell function is still present. So the C-peptide levels are just marginally lower than normal compared to our controls in our study. So in a asymptomatic patient, would I intervene? Probably no, or I still put a question mark there. But for when patients have pain and patients have complications, they need interventions. Once you decide which group the patient is, then you need to know the morphology of the pancreas, both of the duct and the gland. and you need to ask yourself some questions. Where are the strictures? Is there additional pathology like pseudocysts or pancreatic ductal disruptions leading to a pancreatic pleural effusion or ascites? Is there portal hypertension? Is there a mass? Is there cancer? Is there vascular involvement in terms of erosion to an artery and a pseudoaneurysm? All these has to be assessed so that one has a thorough understanding of the whole picture before we intervene in any form. A big question, is early intervention useful? And there is greater and greater pressure on the clinician to intervene early for various reasons, because there have been a number of studies, including one from our center, which showed that surgery or even endoscopic drainage, in one study, endoscopic drainage did improve the pancreatic function. Other studies did not show benefit with endoscopy, but there was one study which showed that. And out of 88 A patients followed for 5 years, 77 required intervention when prospectively followed up. So many patients who are just dismissed without being placed in a strict follow-up clinic often are lost to follow-up, often develop complications, go to other centers, and eventually when it's not clear how often they develop in symptoms. The second conundrum is that patients who seem to have been operated and who have a thorough drainage of the pancreas seem to have less cancers than the prevailing superimposition of cancer in chronic pancreatitis. And the retrospective study published from Japan by the Tanaka group showed that even non-resectional surgery, like the Frey operation, the Partington operation, could actually decrease cancer risk. Although this is a retrospective analysis, when surgery was not performed, the risk of cancer was higher and statistically significantly higher. And that is something that we have to consider. The big question, as Raja Kalayarasan put it in his paper from JIPMA Pondicherry, is when is the intervention? The intervention usually does not occur anywhere where there is a sentinel acute pancreatitis event, not even where there is progression. It's only when there is established chronic pancreatitis. And is that too late, really? When is there a field change going to happen before that? And these are questions that are difficult to answer. However, data is emerging to suggest that early surgery may produce an increased likelihood of complete pain relief, a reduced risk of pancreatic insufficiency, a lower reintervention rate. And that is especially true in the idiopathic pancreatitis, which affects a 28-year-old woman who is neither a smoker nor a drinker, does not chew tobacco, and who has no modifiable risk factors whatsoever. And really, it may be inappropriate to simply wait for things to go wrong. If we should intervene early, should it be endoscopy or surgery? And the ESCAPE randomized clinical trial randomized 44 patients, 2 groups of 44 patients each. They described early intervention, but I don't know what really is early. They talked about the early phase of narcotic use, and that I believe is rather late in some ways. There was no doubt that surgical patients had better outcomes. What was more important, that thus far, all the randomized trials had shown some early benefit with surgery, but endoscopy was still being attempted or first tried because it was believed to be the lesser procedure and would produce less complications, and there would be less chance of, say, mortality, whereas pancreatic surgery could have mortality. However, the hospital stay, complications, and quality of life were similar in the two groups, suggesting that pancreatic surgery has become rather safe in chronic pancreatitis. So the randomized trials showed in the 2003 and 2007 with a follow-up long-term study showed that resoundingly that surgery is perhaps superior. I just wish to, in passing, mention that we do perform stents for pancreatic duct strictures. We do perform lithotripsy for pancreatic calculi, and certainly do stents for ductal disruptions in chronic pancreatitis, which is a good temporizing measure. And if the ductal involvement is less, patients would have a good outcome, may never require surgery, especially if they are alcoholic and they stop the alcohol. In biliary obstruction, by and large, even though expandable stents have been used, still the long-term results are not as satisfactory. But temporizing effect in cholangitis is unquestionable. There has been a tendency now to, if plastic stents do not work, then why don't you use fully covered expandable metallic stents, and thus use stents as a definitive therapy in chronic pancreatitis. The idea is excellent, but what the data has shown is that these strictures do open up more than plastic stents will open them up, but they migrate, and there is a de novo stenosis which happens. So 26.9% stent migration, 23% new stricture, and 7% strength fracture. So it was not all hunky-dory when you did an expandable stent. And this paper was published 2 weeks ago. So if you have a patient who has pain, I would like to categorize the pain, and I'll explain to you exactly why I mean by categorizing the pain. When you use medication and when you use endoscopic therapies, as I said, in ductal disruptions, dominant head strictures, or temporizing effect in biliary obstruction, I would like to do either even endoscopy or surgery early. I would not like to patient to become a narcotic dependent. And if the patient is a narcotic, the process of de-addiction must continue parallel with the attempts to relieve pain. So we must not, like, say, in a deceased donor pool, ask for alcohol abstinence for 6 months or longer before you can actually do something for these patients, because there is intractable pain and the pain has to be relieved. Otherwise, the patient will resort to alcohol again. So our own method of assessment is to use a 4-grade system. 1, when there's no pain. 2, there's mild pain. 3, severe pain. And 4, unrelieved pain. But most importantly, there are 2 other categories: whether the pain is relieved by drugs and whether the pain is interfering with the normal lifestyle of the patient. And I believe that the visual analog scale can be very subjective. The patient who is very concerned about the treatment may actually report a higher score, and the patient who is afraid of intervention may report a lower score. But if you are able to assess, and it takes time to assess, that the patient actually has interference with his normal life or her normal lifestyle, and whether or not the drugs relieve the pain, that's an important criterion, whether you can actually continue medical treatment or not. It's important to assess the exocrine and endocrine function, because you will then know what happens to these patients after intervention. And we choose the URTCQLQ30. It's a cancer questionnaire, but it works perfectly, especially when you add a PAN28 questionnaire with it. So if you have a, if the clinical situation 3 is complication, the ABC system, the C, you have a whole set of complications which require endoscopy and surgery in pseudocysts, angioembolization and pseudoaneurysms, head strictures, endoscopy and surgery, portal hypertension by and large requires some form of surgery, mass lesions, undilated ducts, and chain of leaks often are better off operated, as also duodenal obstructions. So I'm just going to sum up our surgical principles. Who should undergo surgery? I would like to follow up an idiopathic or tropical pancreatitis patient who is asymptomatic, treat the functional deficiency, and reserve pain, surgery for those patients who have pain or complications, who are either unsuitable for endotherapy or who have failed it, or if there is doubt of proven cancer. In alcoholic pancreatitis, there is a risk modification possible. And there is a possibility, especially in our country, that with excellent counseling, that we are able to de-addict them. And then I would be willing to, wait on intervention for them a little while longer, or do interim interventions and not do the definitive procedure. And then only when it fails, I would take them up for endotherapy or surgery. Surgical options are in 4 groups. You have a drainage operation, which, as Isaji wrote this excellent article 10 years ago, which said, is lateral pancreaticojejunostomy or the Pusto operation obsolete? And I believe it is, and I'll explain why. Resection operations, the Whipple resection, the distal pancreatectomy, and the total pancreatectomy. The Whipple and the distal pancreatectomy, I would not use unless in specific situations, because it does not address the entire gland. So we need a procedure which addresses the entire gland. The total pancreatectomy would do that, but it will leave the patient with an apancreatic state, and the management would be quite difficult. There are other methods like nerve interruption, which is really not that successful. Islet transplantation has excellent results in certain cases. In India, the few centers who have tried to extract islets from a fibrotic gland, they've had difficulty, and still the jury is out. The ideal procedure must address the entire gland. And I say this because this is a progressive disease, and so often that we have tended to deal with the predominant pathology, either in the body or the tail or in the head, and found that there is a tail stricture or there is a head mass. So it is requiring a second intervention, and that would be a failure of the first intervention. The operation must be, whatever the procedure, must be safe, low morbidity, virtually no mortality. It should treat both the primary disease plus complications, and must have long-term durability, and certainly must preserve quality of life, for which I think preservation of the parenchyma is very good. If you resect the gland, then you can actually end up, maybe taking the pancreas out, but creating functional deficiency, along with, in some cases, there is a neuropathic element, and the patient continues to have pain. I have some 10 commandments. This is for my residents, and we can discuss this. I believe that the best assessment of the pathology or the morphology can only be done preoperatively. It's very difficult sometimes to unravel the pathology or the morphology on the table. So do a good preoperative assessment. Good mobilization and exposure of the pancreas is critical. Everyone does mobilize the head of the pancreas by a Cocker's maneuver, but they do not necessarily dissect the upper and lower borders of the pancreas, which actually jettisons the pancreas off the retroperitoneum, and also defines the limits of the operation. I have a general tendency to describe every operation in terms of what are the goals of the operation and what are the limits of the operation. If you have both of these clearly strategized, you have pretty much conquered that the plan of the operation. Then what remains is to execute it. It is important to expose the third part of the duodenum perfectly, because you need more space for the jejunal loop to lie there. And if you have left the mesocolon stick to the third part of the duodenum, you may find that there is less space there, especially if you have done a very thorough head coring, and that's the basic operation which I prefer. I would, of course, identify and expose the superior mesenteric vein, regardless of how long it takes, because it's so important to, again, tell me the limits. Ligate the gastroepiploic artery, and also ligate the gastroduodenal artery, but in continuity, close to the upper border of the pancreas, within the pancreas. Now, to detect the duct, I can do it at the body of the neck if the duct is dilated, and work towards the head. But if the duct is not dilated, I simply start by coring the head. And the critical thing is to do small bits of pancreas at a time. Achieve meticulous hemostasis with fine proline or bipolar electrocautery. When I use bipolar electrocautery, I tend to usually reinforce them with fine proline later on. I use a 2-layered anastomosis. I know many of my colleagues do not use only 1 layer. I like the initial layer, which allows the jejunum to simply hitch perfectly onto the pancreas, and gives me, again, the playground for the all ports layer. I use magnification in most cases. If the patient is unwell in terms of hyperproteinemia or sepsis, or the pancreas is edematous, and or if the patient had to be given lots of fluids and the jejunum is edematous, I would add a feeding jejunostomy, or at least a nasojejunal tube for feeding. I do not use octreotide routinely, and the data did not show that it helps, but for want of anything else. And I believe that the data is a little unfair to octreotide. I believe a new study, multi-center study, may show benefit for some reasons that I can explain. I would use them in patients with a high-risk pancreas. The long-term results of the FRAY and published data have shown that 5-year pain relief can be in the 90s. And this is from 2 countries, one from here and one from the US. It is a tradition that narrow ducts require resection. And I want to probably end that controversy. This is the first slide which I showed you of the narrow duct disease. And at least 17 years ago, we published this paper where 4 millimeter or less ducts could be anastomosed to the jejunum after head coring. If you could do a head coring, you could pick the duct. And in fact, the hub of the needle is only about 4 millimeters, and that's the circumference of this duct. And the patients had excellent pain relief in the comparable to those with large size ducts with a comparable functional deficiency, which is now will continue to stand the test of time. And we have larger groups, larger numbers of patients with equally gratifying results. So narrow ducts must not be resected because they will then produce a pancreatic probably cripple and all the problems of pancreatic enzyme replacement, which would be a big problem. So earlier we used to use a lot of ingenious techniques to cut down on the stone or inject contrast under ultrasound guidance, inject it into the gland by mistake, distal pancreatectomy, or even a transampullary approach, which is a really horrible way of approaching the pancreatic duct. But later on, wisdom prevailed, and the most important thing is to do a head coring. The duct reveals itself, even the narrowest duct. So we haven't had to do the Jacobs-Bicky type of re-excision ever. Touch wood. Why don't we do the operation laparoscopically or by robotic approach? And there have been a few papers, and in the last 17 years, laparoscopic pancreaticojejunostomy. Some of the largest series are from my friend Paranivelu, and there have been laparoscopic fries as well. And Sedilnathan, who has pretty much the largest series other than China. That's a modified fry, and I'll explain what he means by a modified fry. What the systematic review has shown is that it's certainly technically feasible, it's safe, effective, and the morbidity and mortality are very low. Most series are very small, and the follow-up is short. There have been some comparative studies as well. In China, duodenum preserving resections done laparoscopic versus laparoscopic PD. Hridaya Nag in Delhi has done this, not randomized, but a matched study of 38 open and 38 lap procedures, where he showed that it's feasible. He's I believe, a very skilled laparoscopic surgeon, and I'm sure we'll get better and better results from him. Sedilnathan has published this paper of modified fry procedure, where he stays in front of the pancreatic duct. The portion behind the pancreatic duct is not dealt with, and he has selected patients who have a duct size more than 7 millimeters, patients who do not have extensive head calcification, and whose head are not enlarged and who don't have local complications, only for this process. And even where 10 out of 15 had to be converted because of duct not being identified, bleeding, or doubt of cancer in 4 cases. So this is the Nag paper, which showed that there were 4 laparoscopic cases and open 11 fray procedures, and the results were pretty much comparable. And I think the skill of these surgeons are going to overcome all the technical difficulties. A diagram of the modified fry, and I believe it's inadequate because all these ducts which go deep into the Ansenet process do not get cleared, and it's a ripe situation for admission with symptoms and probably requiring a second procedure. Perhaps the most interesting development is the use of indocyanine green to see the bile duct during the head coring. So you can decide whether you want to cut it or open, or whether you want to leave it or avoid it. So I think we have now embraced this technology. In fact, this is something that I've never tried, but these are papers published earlier this year, which showed that you can actually apply the LCS harmonic scalpel on the pancreas, and apparently it creates pancreatic lithotripsy, and I'm not sure it really happens. I have to try it before I make a comment. Of course, the urge to go laparoscopic has produced some strange operations, and this is a operation where there's been a transection of the neck and a double pancreatic jejunostomy. I think it will be quite difficult. In 1994, we embarked on laparoscopic pancreatic jejunostomy, and we ended up transecting the neck of the body of the pancreas. And we had to open up, convert, re-anastomose the two ends of the pancreas, and then do a lateral pancreatic jejunostomy. The patient is still alive and well today, but we realized some of the limitations for laparoscopic approach in pancreatic disease. The most important being the lack of the educated sensitive hand behind the duodenum and the head of the pancreas, which actually presses forward when there is a bleed, which guides you the extent of head coring, which prevents you from making a perforation in the posterior capsule, and in every sense helping the guiding the process. And the absence of that educated sensitive hand is perhaps the biggest difficulty with laparoscopic surgery. I also want to say that in response to the modified Frey procedure, that we ourselves have realized that over 3 time groups, we have become more radical in our Frey procedure. And as Dr. Sathik Sikora suggested, it should be called an extended Frey procedure, where even if there is no mass, the triangular wedge of the head is removed, the head duct is cleared up to the papilla, the sentinel stone is removed, the inferior portion of the head below the main duct is also cleared, and you use either correlation with the CT scan or use intraoperative C-arm to actually find out if there are calculi, because if calculi are present, they usually mean there are strictures, and they should be cleared, and do it in all cases. So if you do a thorough enough head coring, it is tantamount to an excavation. We find that the re-intervention rates are dramatically less, from 30% to 10% to 2%, depending on how aggressive or how thorough we were in our coring. So initially, in our experience, we did only a lesser form of it, Frey procedure, and that was not adequate apparently, and they required re-intervention. A re-intervention being a surrogate marker for failure of the procedure. I wish to also highlight the fact that chronic pancreatitis head masses can be in two forms. One is the stone-centric mass and the mass-centric mass. And as you can see here, there's an inflammatory mass here. This was proven to be non-malignant by biopsy and also by reasonable follow-up. So when you have a stone-centric head mass, it is quite sufficient to lay open the ducts, to remove the calculi, and then to remove or decapitate the intervening pancreatic parenchyma to provide a shallow head coring for anastomosis. Whereas in the mass-centric mass, you actually have to take an initial coring, and then you will expose side branches, and then you may do some filling out of that and then proceed. I always like to show this video where Dr. Lekha uses a left-handedness to show how a fresh areca nut, there's a fresh areca nut which is very soft, is being cored with a knife, and this is exactly the way I would like my residents to core the pancreas, small bits at a time, and they can go concentric bits. Each time they do that, they open up new ducts, and they can lay open those ducts, remove calculi, open up strictures, rather than taking it all in one fell swoop. So this is our technique, and I'm going to show you a brief video to highlight that this is a precise technique, a slow process. When they will do the operation slowly, it actually finishes fast, and a bloodless process. I'm sorry. So when you remove concentric side walls of the head from a central coring, you end up opening into ductal side branches. And when you open into ductal side branches, then you encounter calculi, calcareous material, pus, which you can then extract, remove, or drain, or even pseudocysts. Sometimes you can see that there are some calculi which are showing up. And the hand is behind the duodenum, as you can see, calcareous material there. And you can explore those ducts, take out all the stones, Don't dig very hard because you could damage a vessel. You can use bipolar to control the bleeding and keep the field dry, but it's a good idea to reinforce them with proline later on. You can see that each core is taken is not a large core, and it gives you the option of conserving the parenchyma yet producing the best extent of drainage. As you do it, you can see that new ductal branches are opened up. Bleeding is stopped by pressure on the back of the pancreas and by bipolar, as you can see. And stones are removed again. The ducts are explored, filleted out, and then the procedure and this opening tissue can be removed, as you can see there. Can you keep your probe there and then cut open on the probe, so which will allow you to really drain the duct without actually removing all the tissue. The field has to be absolutely dry at the end of the operation before you do the anastomosis, as you can see here. Today, despite all the progress that's happened from Comfort and Bagel's 1946 paper, we still have considerable diagnostic difficulty in telling benign from malignant disease. There is still lack of clarity as to what to do with a mildly symptomatic patient. There is still a lot of controversy as to whether we should use endotherapy or surgery and in whom, although I hope I have clarified many of the situations. Really, how early should one intervene? And one is certainly not sure. If there's a genetic basis, have we cracked it? Can we prevent this disease altogether? Because even patients who have alcohol-induced pancreatitis, there is a genetic susceptibility which has been identified, and therefore we need to open this genetic, key to this cipher. The biggest problem in chronic pancreatitis is the fact that this disease presents to different specialists, and depending on whom it reaches, the approach is different. Even the type of disease, the spectrum of the disease that it presents is quite different. If you go to Dr. V. Mohan's Diabetology Institute in Chennai, 100% of the patients have fibrocalculous pancreatic diabetes. About 40%, I believe is a correct figure, had calculi. None had pain. Whereas in a patient who is at the other end, a pancreatic surgeon, patients who come there invariably have pain, and in fact, further have complications. So if you go to a clinical gastroenterologist who does not do endoscopy, there is a steadfast conservatism, and then the patient would be on antioxidants, despite even if there is a large pathomorphological change that may not be highlighted. An endoscopist will, of course, consider endoscopy, but I think the most important thing is that these 5 blind men must sit together and talk to each other if they want to really prevent any research in chronic pancreatitis from becoming a process of frustration. I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, H.R.AMESH sir, for the wonderful talk. It's a brilliant talk as usual. Actually, whenever we happen to hear Dr. H.R.AMESH, we get more and more of, even if it is the same subject, we get more and more of new points. Actually, because the Onam and Rakshabandhan, actually we are scared that the participants will be less. Actually, 255 participants joined directly to the Zoom. They can ask the questions directly, or we can write in the chat box. I hand over the mic to Dr. Pradeep RABELLA for further proceedings.
Thank you, Ramesh, for a wonderful talk as usual. Before we open up for this thing, I just wanted some clarification. So you have the enigma, you have put a last slide. I think, is it not worthwhile to now look at multimodal meetings? Because many times the patients are still confused. You go to an endoscopist, you advise stenting, the clinical gastroenterologist will continue on medical treatment. So is it not worthwhile to have a multimodal meeting with the patient to sort out this, so the patients is not have a more clear idea of what he should follow.
I couldn't agree with you more. And unfortunately, even the multidisciplinary meetings that happen all over the world happen in the boardroom. And the patient, it is not as though, even if there is a coordinator who posts the information, it is not as though one member of each specialty actually examines the patient. Unless they actually examine the patient, it is unlikely that there would be a consensus. What actually happens is that if I present a case where it appears that the patient has intractable pain and he's got multiple strictures, and if the patient has, doubt for malignancy, it will be easy for anybody else in the panel to say, yes, go ahead and operate. But essentially, that may not be the case if it's examined by another specialist. So true multidisciplinary care is unfortunately far from a reality in most centers, both in our country and I'm happy to say it's like that in the West as well, in the developed world. But actually, it's a very sad thing, because the patient deserves more. The patient deserves. We cannot afford to be, have any opinionated dogma in this matter. We cannot determine that the patient who takes drugs does not deserve to get better. Because one patient actually asked me for the first time, I have pain now and I relieve my pain with a drink. Now, if you're not going to relieve the pain and you're going to ask me to stop drinking, is that fair? And that's when I had to change my policy. And I said, we will intervene straight away, and then we would support him. I think we all need to be a little pragmatic.
Yeah. So another usual question, Ramesh, for from the student's perspective, suspicious head mass. Will you get a tissue diagnosis, or will you straight away subject the patient for a Whipple's pancreatectomy upfront? Now I would like to divide them into several groups. I would always do a tissue diagnosis, because that is the group in which we did a lot of unnecessary Whipple resections. 27% of our Whipple resections in chronic pancreatitis had benign disease. In the similar group in terms of non-chronic pancreatitis head masses, only 1% or 2% had benign disease. So there we obviously got the diagnosis right. But in chronic pancreatitis masses, we were erring on the side of cancer, which is acceptable. But 27% erring is perhaps a little too much. So I would like to recommend biopsy in all these cases. And if biopsy is negative, if the clinical suspicion is more, then you could even repeat the biopsy. Because if you do a Whipple resection in a patient who has chronic pancreatitis and is benign, the patient is not going to die on you, because he or she is going to live the rest of their life with diabetes, with pancreatic enzyme, substitutes in large doses, and loss of weight, and poor overall pancreatic function, as well as general health, which impedes their quality of life. In fact, in India, insurance companies don't support outpatient medication. So their pancreatic enzymes are not covered by insurance. And that's a major burden. So in many parts of the Western world, they do cover post-operative medication, but not here. So I would really be careful about, doing the big Whipple straight away. I could even argue that the benefit you may get by a Whipple in chronic pancreatitis cancers may be much less, because it may be advanced and it may actually be inoperable, or at least may have spread at the time, and the survival benefit may be less. Of course, that's an extreme view, but by and large, I would like to suffice to say that I wouldn't do biopsy. Okay. Any questions from the chat? We have questions in the chat box.
Shall I take those questions?
You have questions in the chat box. If you can take one by one, please take.
Yeah, the first question is from Dr. Shafkat, who says, first ERCP for chronic pancreatitis with a pancreatic duct stricture. I presume that stricture is in the head. The choice of stent will be single or multiple. It depends on what stent goes, actually. And I think I'm speaking for my endoscopy colleagues, that they would even place a 5 French stents first, and then upsize it to 7 or even 10. And they would add multiple stents. Right at the beginning, they may find it difficult to place more than one stent. And if there are calculi, they would like to do ESWL rather than just place a stent. And there's a big controversy on how long the stents must be placed. I always like to tease my colleagues by saying that they never have to remove the stent because the stent comes out by itself. But it's, that's a little extreme again. Stents do migrate and slip into the intestine. But most endoscopists now believe that they should keep the stents longer or replace the stents on a 3-monthly basis. One of the two must be done. That is their preference. Let me go down. So somebody asked how to define chronic pancreatitis, and I believe that I have defined it, so I don't have to go. I did not go to groove pancreatitis because that's a big subject in itself. But I can summarize it by saying that if you have a patient who has disease largely confined to the groove of the pancreas and the duodenum, you have two problems. One is to manage the patient who may have duodenal obstruction, who may have pancreatic duct obstruction and or biliary obstruction, and also rule out cancer in the same format. If you have a patient with idiopathic, non-alcoholic pancreatitis who gets groove pancreatitis, I would like to put my money on malignancy because it is an accompaniment of alcohol abuse. And without alcohol, I believe at least my observation is that groove pancreatitis is certainly not very common. So I would say that, again, I would like to classify groove pancreatitis as those with main duct involvement. If there are calculi elsewhere, if there are duct strictures elsewhere, then the approach is easier. But do not necessarily do Whipple resections unless there is real serious doubt of malignancy or malignancy proven. So I would like to do conservative approaches, again, a FRI procedure if possible. So what is the end point of endotherapy? And that is one of the problems that endotherapy has, because if they have achieved a fairly big ductal size, I mean, in the sense diameter, the stricture has been effaced and the patient is asymptomatic, they are willing to give an endoscopy-free, stent-free vacation. But many of these patients, because they perceive the endotherapy as a lesser procedure, they do not always go for follow-up if they are well. If they have a problem, they may go back, but if they don't have problems or they don't have pain, they often go to, don't return to the same center. If they do have problems, they go to a second center and they say, okay, and they do a Google and then they decide that maybe surgery is the answer. So my own criteria for timing of surgery is if there is intractable pain in the type I mentioned, or if there are complications, I would be quite happy to operate them. So I do coring with a monopolar cautery, as you could see, and you could see how I dealt with the bleeding. And obviously these questions were placed before the video clip was shown. If there's ductal dilatation of 8 millimeters with the pancreatic duct stone at the head region about 6 millimeters with mild obstruction in the CP, choice of procedure, I would do a head coring in this patient without a doubt. A 33-year-old female presenting discomfort while having food only, now taking pancreatic enzymes before meals, but no need of what? Can't see what.
Dr. Anwar is there.
Anwar, can you ask the question, please?
Anwar, can you please unmute? I will unmute your audio.
Sir, no need of taking narcotics.
Yeah.
Painkiller.
So, if it depends again on how much that pain is disturbing the patient. I agree that the 33-year-old woman without any, precipitating or risk modifying factors is, I will have a slightly lower threshold to surgery than a patient who is a heavy smoker or a drinker, because this patient has really nowhere to go, and we have to offer an intervention. What would you do when a duct is not dilated and the pain is not relieved by usual analgesics? I have already answered the question that ductal dilatation is not necessary for surgery. Ascitic fluid amylase, other than pancreatic ascites and chronic pancreatitis. If you have ascites in chronic pancreatitis, it can happen due to two reasons. One is just because of the general inflammation, and there is some reactive collection of peritoneal fluid that may not be high amylase. But if it's a pancreatic ascites, it will be like amylase rich and protein rich, both. Pancreatic ascites is amylase rich and protein rich. And in such cases with MR, you would be able to diagnose the communication, and that would confirm the diagnosis. Of course, for MR, sometimes you have to tap the ascites completely, because otherwise the fluid in the peritoneal cavity would completely obscure the picture. You would not see any pancreatic duct. Dr. Shafkat again asked, in calcific pancreatitis with only parenchymal calcification with PD stones, any role of ESWL? Parenchymal calcification, and I contest that, because what appears to be in the side branches, what actually is in the side branches, looks like it's parenchymal calcification. Because when you do a X-ray or when you do an ultrasound, you find that the stones are lying away from the midpoint of the pancreas, and you would be tempted to think that there's in the parenchyma. It's actually in the side branches. The only condition where you get pancreatic calcinosis is hyperparathyroidism. And so all our patients, especially those who have calcific pancreatitis, always get a fasting serum calcium level. And if that is high, we have then we would do a parathormone and then look for a parathyroid adenoma. And we have operated a large number of patients with parathyroid adenomas first. And some of those patients have never required intervention for the pancreatitis thereafter. So that's something that we learned along the way. Patient with chronic calcific pancreatitis with 7 mm duct stricture, CVD stricture, portal vein and splenic vein thrombosis, and extensive periportal collaterals. Now, this patient's symptoms are very critical. If the patient, what is the patient's symptom? If the patient has severe abdominal pain, then some intervention would become necessary. So what I would do is to treat the CVD stricture by an endoscopic stent, to do endoscopic variceal obliteration for either gastric or gastroesophageal varices. And when the patient is stable from those 2 points of view, then consider even surgery. Extensive periportal collaterals are a problem technically, but the problem is that if you are careful and if you are slow, you can get the pancreatic duct. And what's more, head coring is the technically difficult procedure, and in many cases we have been unable to do head coring in these patients, but you can drain the duct in these cases. This is Dr. Ellen Das. In my personal experience, that is Dr. Anharul Rahman. Can you ask the question, please? I can't somehow see it in my chat box.
Is it Madheswaran Jinnathambi or Prakash?
Sorry? In my personal experience, it says, and then it just goes, I don't see the rest of the, anyway, I missed that.
Yeah.
So the route of choice of biopsy in chronic pancreatitis, I think I would always do a US, and it's not available, is not a problem. These are not emergency biopsies. You can always send it to a center where it's available. I think the other lesson one has learned is that we need to pool our resources. Everybody does not need to have all the equipment in their hospital. Most cities now have one, at least one, even small towns have one US center. In 1992, in 2002, when we set up Lakeshore Hospital, we did not have a working angiography suite. And I remember that a 40-year-old man who had post-pancreatectomy bleed was taken by ambulance by one of my colleagues to Coimbatore, where Dr. Matthew Cherian did an embolization. Patient was retained there for 24 hours to be stabilized and then brought back, and the patient is alive today to tell the tale. And so at that time, other centers in Cochin also did not have the facility. So we were happy to take the patient 160 kilometers. So the lesson that I would like to learn from that is that we need to pool our resources. We don't all need to have everything. So I would still use an US biopsy. So lipase units after surgery in PERT. Now, if you talk to the purists, if you talk to, say, somebody like, you know, some of the Europeans who have done all the studies on PERT, they require a minimum of 40,000 IPS units per meal, and which means that you're going to have something like 6 tablets minimum. And actually they advise up to 12 tablets. And I think many of our patients will be unable to take that kind of medication strength. But the other side of it is that the patients don't have such a high fat intake as in the West. And in fact, our own dietary studies have shown that fat intake is like 40 grams or no, not more. And therefore, steatorrhea, symptomatic steatorrhea is much less in our country. What is more important is to look for fat-soluble vitamins and micronutrients which are often deficient and which we never pick up. Vitamin D is another item which does not get enough attention. I think it should be replaced. Where I am now, I think I've lost.
Hello.
Is pancreatic
Hello,
duct
sir.
biopsy?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please go ahead, Chivalal, sir.
Sir, I am Dr. Anhar Rahman from Bangladesh. I am practicing general surgery and laparoscopic and pancreatic surgery in Dhaka. Sir, in my personal experience for the last 2 months, I have done 5 to 6 patients for chronic pancreatitis, pancreatic calculi. One patient was there is a duct diameter about 1.5 cm. I have I have just removed lots of stones, about 3 to 5 stones, but there was a large stones just in the main pancreatic duct in the head region. What I left, because it was very impacted, and I thought if I relieve, there is a injury, chance of injury in the major vessels. So after that surgery, the patient was well. And in hospital, after 10th period, the patient goes in the house. There was no pain. Post-operative, the patient was excellent. After 10 days in the home, the patient is well. But after 1 month, the patient complains by over phone that the patient has severe abdominal pain like before the surgery. Then I advise some analgesics and advise some dietary advice. But still, the patient's pain did not relieve. The intensity did not improve. In that case, sir, what can I do for the patient, sir?
At this moment, I guess you can attempt endoscopic ERCP, whether you are able to cannulate the ampulla, whether you are able to inject contrast. Is the contrast able to opacify this duct which contains the stone? If it does, if the contrast is also opacifying the pancreatogenostomy, then you can consider ESWL as an option. Otherwise, we'll have to reoperate the patient. So we've had this experience in more than one case or in several cases where we have not removed a certain area of calculi and found that those areas become inflammatory masses. So I would certainly recommend at this time ERCP. So another question was, is pancreatic duct biopsy routine during LPJ?
Thank you,
Yeah, thank you. Yes, once the tissue is removed, it's always sent for biopsy. But a frozen section is done only when you suspect malignancy. We published a paper in the Indian Journal of Gastroenterology about what happens if the head coring biopsy comes as malignancy. And I think that clearly shows that once you've got a post-operative biopsy, you've pretty much lost the battle, and it's too late now because you have invaded the cancer planes. Dr. Shankar Subramaniam wants me to highlight the role of ESWL in CCP. ESWL per se, I think we have 2 schools of thought. One which says that you need a stent placed, or you need at least a clarity as to the stentability or the cannulability of the ampulla of the pancreatic duct before you do ESWL. Some others say it's not required. but certainly ESWL is an important modality in the endoscopic therapy of calculi in chronic pancreatitis. Without fragmenting the stones, you can't expect things to improve. But tight strictures are equally a problem. So I think if endotherapy has to work in patients with significant disease, then it has to be fairly aggressive and fairly thorough. And even then, the long-term results, one is concerned as that may not be as durable as that of surgery in those cases. But if there's limited stone load, it's a wonderful modality. And if the disease is confined to the head. So Dr. Sindhu says that in their study of predictors of survival in malignant CCP, they found that alcohol, hypertriglyceridemia, smoking, and newly detected diabetes were all risk factors which showed up in their study. I can only say that did they have steatorrhea as well, I wonder? But steatorrhea is not a prominent symptom in India, in Kerala certainly, and I don't know what she would like to tell us. Dr. Sindhu, would you like to say something?
Sindhu is there in the audience. Sindhu, please unmute.
Hello, sir. Good evening, Baiju, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, actually, we were on the last stage of our survival analysis. And surprisingly, a new finding came up that was steatorrhea affecting the survival in carcinoma arising in CCP. Those underwent curative, R0 resection. So this came up as an...
What is R0 resection in CCP?
Sir, it is by definition in our study that margins are including the retroperitoneal margins became negative.
You mean CCP cancers?
Yes, sir.
CCP cancers, you say that steatorrhea correlated with poor results or no poor results or better results?
Poor results, poor predictor of predictor of worse survival.
This was in a retrospective analysis or a prospective study?
Yes, sir. Of course, it is a retrospective analysis.
So that's the problem with retrospective analysis, because the documentation is never perfect, and sometimes we end up having these confounding results, which we then have to explain. It can be surmised that steatorrhea would happen in a patient with more long-standing disease, and consequently there was a greater propensity for cancer to develop. So it could be used as an indirect marker for more advanced disease, perhaps, but it would require a prospective study to validate that. Dr. Arun Kumar has a very interesting googly. He says a 28-year-old patient with pain abdomen, and he doesn't tell us how severe the pain is. He has hypertriglyceridemia. He doesn't tell us what the levels of triglycerides is. Alcohol and smoking, yes, without telling us how much alcohol and how much smoking. And newly detected diabetes. Ultrasound shows specks, but no, what does it say?
Arun, can you please unmute? Arun is unmuted.
No steatorrhea. Yeah, Arun.
Good evening, sir. I'm Dr. Arun, sir. I'm student of Dr. Baiju Senathan, sir.
You're all students of Dr. Baiju. I object to your trying to take that position. We're all students of Baiju, please.
Go ahead.
Sir, yes. Sir, there is a patient, 28 years old. He has an alcoholic history. He had a binge drink, sir. He has an triglyceride level of 280, sir. To be precise, the day we had got done. He's newly detected. His sugar level is 280, sir.
Sugar is also 280. Triglyceride also is 280. Everything is 280.
280 is in the range, sir. His FVS is 140 and 260 odd is exact value, sir.
So what is the CRP?
Sir, CRP is 38, sir.
Yeah. So I think we are dealing with an acute pancreatitis.
Yes,
hypertriglyceridemia is not generally commonly associated with chronic pancreatitis, although the recurrent acute pancreatitis of hypertriglyceridemia can go on to become chronic pancreatitis in some cases, but levels of over 1,000 are required for hypertriglyceridemic pancreatitis to normally occur. Often values are over 5,000.
Yes, sir.
I think if you just place an nasogeneral tube in this patient and fed him and kept the patient in the hospital for a while and discharged him with an NJ tube, they would just settle down. And then you could get the patient off alcohol and smoking and perhaps that will be the end of the problem, hopefully.
A patient with a recurrent acute on chronic pancreatitis, when will you operate? And actually, if you are doing an operation, training procedure, that patient is likely to get acute again, or what is your opinion?
I think if you have a CRP over 40, if you have CT scan showing peripancreatic fat stranding or collections, I would not like to take the patient up for surgery. I would suggest NJ tube placement, feeding, allow the process to settle down. And then the question, one of the trickiest portions is to decide whether you want to operate in the same setting or whether you want to send the patient home and then call them back, because often once the NJ tube is removed and the patient goes back to oral diet, another episode of acute pancreatitis, acute and chronic pancreatitis supervenes. So in some cases, we just have to keep the patient in hospital or discharge the patient on the NJ tube and then bring them back for surgery. So some cases where despite NJ tube placement and despite supportive therapy, patient does not improve, then laparoscopy, oblique, even laparotomy to wash and clean and relieve all the peripancreatic collections is worthwhile. I would certainly not recommend direct pancreatic surgery at this time, because this is a small subgroup in which you would have more leaks and more complications, especially bleeding complications. So I would recommend a two-stage procedure. Of course, a lot of this can be done laparoscopically, but sometimes you need open surgery to drain collections and to relieve the pancreatic necrosis if they are present.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Sudhi has is PET CT scan useful in the gut mass suspicious of malignancy?
The standardized uptake value or the SUV BACS, the average or the maximal standardized uptake value overlaps between chronic pancreatitis and malignancy. But let's say you have a difficult situation where you have a head mass, biopsies, equivocal, you haven't got a solution, and there are no resource crunch. You can do a PET CT, because if it shows you metastasis in the lungs, if it shows uptake in the lungs, then straight away it's a game, set, and match. Then there is no doubt that this is pancreatic cancer. So I cannot completely dismiss PET CT. However, I must mention to you that in terms of the pancreatic mass itself, it may not give you the answer, because it is very similar to chronic pancreatitis itself.
What is the role of elastography by US?
Yes, it's not the last word hasn't been said yet. Contrast, US elastography is certainly the new kid in the block, but it's been around for 10 years now, more than 10 years, and we still haven't got any answers. I wonder if Pradeep would like to make a comment, because his center has all the gadgets and all the technology that the world can command. Dr. Pradeep?
I don't think we have also did a study of this elastography in pancreas. We did not find any correlation. I think US is a better modality in picking up these in diagnosis. I don't think elastography is much role as of today.
Yeah, there's an interesting question. It says, is chronic pseudocyst a term still used? I believe that the question refers to the issue of pseudocyst after chronic pancreatitis versus pseudocyst after acute pancreatitis. We all understand that pseudocysts after acute pancreatitis with the revised Atlanta is no necrosis after 4 weeks. That is a pseudocyst in acute pancreatitis, and that's almost so rare that it never happens, because every cyst will have some necrosis. If you do an MRI, you will find some necrosis. So it's all a WN. There is no pseudocyst after acute pancreatitis in present times. It's an obsolete term. If a chronic pancreatitis patient has a pseudocyst, the implications are that the pseudocyst is not the main issue there. The issue is that there is an underlying ductal problem in the form of a stricture, disruption, etc. So all your therapy has to be directed against the ductal disruption as well if it has to succeed. if you can do an endoscopic transpapillary stenting along with the cystogastrostomy or just a true transpapillary stenting, that may tide over the crisis. Whether it will tide over it forever, I'm not sure. But if you have minimal change pancreatic duct disease with a pseudocyst, then you can treat the pseudocyst on its merit and do just a endoscopic cystogastrostomy and then wait and watch to see what happens. So I don't know this. Earlier, when we were residents, we were taught about the acute pseudocyst as that which happens within 6 weeks, and the chronic pseudocyst which happens after 6 weeks in a patient with acute pancreatitis. I think that term has completely been lost now because we have the Research Atlanta from 2003.
Sudhi is there in the audience. So Sudhi, do you want to speak something? Sudhi? Sudhi is unmuted. Now we can go ahead.
There was a question about whether I prefer US FNAC or biopsy. The question is very relevant. Very often our endoscopists would do a biopsy, but one of the problems is that they can't afford to hit a dilated duct because that could cause a problem. But when I do surgery, I generally do a biopsy gun biopsy, and I take several passes because I'm more afraid of missing a malignancy than any biopsy-related complications. There's a comment saying that after LPC surgery, many patients do not relieve pain. So I think I agree with them that this is an operation which is largely obsolete, according to me. I think in pediatric population, where the head is so small, and you can actually open the duct up to the nearly up to the ampulla without doing a coring, I think it's acceptable. But even there, a small head coring is inevitable, in my opinion.
Dr. Roy Mukuda is there. I asked him to unmute. He is not unmuting.
Maybe he's just connected but not there physically.
Probably because he is the right person to answer the endoscopy questions.
I think I've spoken for him more or less. That's exactly what they would do. So Dr. Fahad says how to approach a malignancy arising in a patient with a previous drainage procedure. I presume that the malignancy is happening months or years later. The first question is if it happens within 2 years, it's most likely a cancer that's been missed at the time of the operation. And pretty much the results are very, very dismal. If it is a cancer that's happened much later, I think you should treat it on its own merit. You have to assess the stage. You have to see whether we should do a neoadjuvant approach or whether we should do a surgery first approach. And the problem is that there's going to be a jejunal loop tagged on to the pancreas. One does not necessarily do a total pancreatectomy in all the cases. And I have a technique which I'll be happy to share with whoever wants to, about how to preserve the same jejunal loop and then do a Whipple resection, especially in a patient who gets a cancer years later.
Dr. Narvaria.
Hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just enjoying as usual. He's a fantastic speaker and I always love to watch him. I learned my pancreatic surgery from him. I assisted few cases in early days of my SG week, and I like his touch and go technique. using a cautery and faucet. I do laparoscopic. I don't open at all nowadays, and I'm comfortable doing even head coring. I do laparoscopic.
You should publish it and share the technique as well.
Thank you. Sure, sir. Definitely, I'll show sometime.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Narvaria.
Thank you. Thank you.
Dr. Subbalal sir is there. Actually, I was asking him to unmute because he has got a lot of experience in chronic pancreatitis. If he can unmute, sir, please unmute. Anybody who wanted to ask questions directly, please, sir, go ahead.
No, that was a nice talk, Dr. Ramesh. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Let me ask a doubt. I have seen one of your pictures. It shows a pancreatic duct hugely dilated with a cyst. To me, it looks like a IPMN. IPMN also can present with chronic pancreatitis. Correct me if I am wrong. To me, it looks like IPMN.
That particular patient was not IPMN, sir. Those were the older patients. You know, strangely, such patients are not encountered nowadays at all. Though that particular picture, if you go back to that slide, we can see that this CT dates back to somewhere in the late 1990s. So that kind of dilated duct of 2 centimeters and 2.5 centimeters is very rare now. At least I believe that they are being operated or treated in many other centers, because whereas in those days there were only a handful of centers which dealt with pancreatic disease. Now every little village, I think, has a pancreatic surgeon and a pancreatic endotherapist. So I think there's a distribution of cases, and perhaps many of them very wisely they choose the patients with the less technical challenges, and therefore I don't see those patients. But I think that's what it is. All these patients get their duct biopsied, and IPMN would be a dead giveaway on biopsy. That is not IPMN, sir. But the point that Dr. Bilal is saying, that when there is ductal dilatation, do think of IPMN, because outpouring of mucous mucin from the IPMN would cause a ballooning of the ducts upstream and even downstream. And also, it becomes a difficult task then to determine where the extent of the resection should be, for which frozen section is a must. Because the dilatation may be either because of the IPMN itself, or it may be because of the dilatation by the outpouring of the mucin.
Yeah, actually, Trivandrum Medical College, one of the largest units performing this drainage procedure for chronic calcific. Dr. Ramesh Rajan is there in the audience. Dr. Ramesh, can you please unmute?
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice lectures are very illuminating as usual. And we are left with more, as usual, as you say, more questions than answers to many unsolved problems.
Well, remember what Dr. Baiju said in the beginning. You know, we all need to get a little wiser, isn't it? So
yeah.
He says we need to know that we don't know anything.
Yeah,
go on.
We have very often we get, you see asymptomatic, totally asymptomatic patients picked up while having scans for something else. Some of them really young. So, I mean, how do you exactly go about it? What is your strategy?
I have a simple formula that I just put them on our follow-up clinic, because we have now well over 100 patients who are in this, what I call A0. They have no diabetes, no pain, no steatorrhea. And they are just being followed up. If they don't come for checkups, we call them and then record that in our pro forma.
How frequently would you generally advise one? And then some of the difficult questions these people ask is, like, can I get a malignancy? And once in a while, some of these people ask.
Yes, so, they should get pregnant, because I don't think chronic pancreatitis is precludes.
No, not pregnant, I mean.
Malignant.
I heard it's a pregnancy. I was wondering why they wanted to get pregnant. So, yes, we've had, I recall Dr. C.J. Varghese being very close to litigation on this account, because somewhere in the early 2000s, or I think the late 1990s, he advised the patient expectant management because the patient was not symptomatic. And then the patient was referred back to us by our medical gastroenterologist about 10 years later or 7 years later with inoperable malignancy and extensive retroperitoneal involvement. And later on it showed there was even lung metastasis. So the patient wanted to meet me and he had only one question, that I came here, I said this, I've got these stones, I don't have symptoms, but I said these stones are not supposed to be there. And why I said I was ready to undergo surgery. Dr. Varghese, your colleague, told me that you know, there's no need for surgery and etc. etc. And I think he has killed me. So I think it was a very you know, reasonable statement for him to make. But I had to then take him to my room and then sit him down and talk to him for an hour or more, saying that who knows, even if I had done the surgery, the cancer may have come. A, B, the existing data does not show that you should operate all these patients. And 3, we are not allowed to do experimental medicine at this time. So even if you go to court, you will have the same explanation, because he even threatened me that he would go to court. So I said, that's welcome. This is exactly what I would say. And I would also ask my colleagues to come and give their opinions. I think they would agree. And I think it just fizzled out there. So this can actually happen. And now and then, I have a patient now who is a death during the COVID era. She got COVID. This patient was under the treatment of one of our gastroenterologists in Central Travancore, I think in Chenganur or somewhere, and has been managed medically for the last 10 years. Diabetes, pancreatic enzymes, and just antioxidants. And the patient came here with pain. When I saw her, she had body tail malignancy. At operation, the tumor was resectable, distal pancreatectomy with head coring was done. The patient contracted COVID post-operatively. She was initially very well, and one day she just lungs just exploded. She had to be ventilated, and then she had a prolonged course in the COVID ICU, and she died. So this is unfortunate. I could argue that the previous therapy was inappropriate and that we should have operated this patient, but I can't be sure, can I? Nor can you be sure. So I think for the moment, we'll have to stay there and we'll have to do more prospective studies to try and say, then of course, the question will be when to operate. We have to then operate even earlier, perhaps, in the course of that. So I just don't have the answer for this.
As an extension of that, some asymptomatic or patients with very mild symptoms have rather very thin parenchyma anterior to the duct sometimes. And would you think that is a risk for pancreatic ascites at some stage?
Perhaps not, because there is Ebbe Hodge. I don't know how to pronounce that name. It's a Dutch worker. EBBHOJ has one of the largest papers on pancreatic parenchyma and pancreatic ductal pressures. And he showed that actually ductal pressure may fall in some cases because of atrophy of the gland and effacement of the duct. Just like in intrahepatic calculi, recurrent pyogenic cholangitis, there is actually the liver parenchyma dissolves and therefore the ducts dilate. Same thing would happen here. So we don't know. I don't think there's, in fact, a pancreatic ductal disruption is a result of inflammation, acute inflammation, not of just weakening of the thin parenchyma. And one of the problems that you have is to take proper stitches when you are taking the anastomosis, for which again I recommend that you mobilize the upper and lower border of the pancreas, then you will have ample space to take your stitches. So that's my solution for that problem. But I think you won't get pancreatic ascites.
Yeah. Okay.
One question has popped up in the chat box by Dr. Kanagavil.
Yes. How many of your operated CCP cases go on to develop malignancy? Yes. The figure was on the slide. There were 6 out of 900, and the 900 were followed up for 15 to 20 years, which makes it less than what, 2%.
Anybody who is actually, there are a lot of surgeons who are logging from Kerala who are dealing with chronic calcific pancreatitis. Anybody who wanted to ask questions can unmute or raise your hand. I'll unmute you.
Rajiv, shall I ask one more question to Ramesh?
Yeah, please. Please.
We do give pancreatic enzyme to relieve the pain along with other medical analgesics. Now, my question to Ramesh is, when will you give, what is the timing of the pancreatic enzymes with relation to the meal? Whether it is at the first bite of the meal or middle of the meal or afterward?
I have followed middle of the meal thus far.
And one more question. Some of these patients have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, SIBO. So do you combine the pancreatic enzymes with some antibiotics like rifaximin?
So may I know how you proved SIBO?
You may have to take a jejunal aspiration and look for the count, bacterial count, by a tube.
I confess that I have not studied it.
There can be bacterial overgrowth in pancreatic enzyme deficiency.
Your question is something that I have to now study, in the sense, patients who get pancreatic pain and then you give pancreatic enzymes and they're not relieved, then you have to say the failure of relief is not because of some pathomorphology of the gland, but it's because of SIBO. That will be a difficult, entity to prove, because
can you give empirically?
I would not give. I don't give anything empirically. That's my concern. That giving empirical therapy, except in the most extreme situations when a whole, a battery of specialists sitting together in a multidisciplinary fashion, supported, is probably the best way of stalling progress in medicine. So we need to forget about empirical therapy. I think that in a patient whom you suspect to have SIBO, you may already find a pseudocyst, or you may find ductal strictures, or you may find inflammation in the pancreatic head. And when there is an elephant in the room, why do you want to look for other reasons? So that's probably the reason why I have not even looked for SIBO, and I have not given any empirical therapy. And but I think it can be done. It can be studied that prospectively. Is there SIBO in patients who have pancreatic pain? Of course, the ethical committee may not pass this study. They may ask you why you want to do it, and it means, especially if you're going to do some invasive testing, you may have to do a non-invasive breath test and use that as a indirect evidence.
Yeah, thank you, Shivraj sir. Dr. Madeswaran Chinnathambi is a surgical gastroenterologist from Coimbatore. He wanted to ask some questions.
Good evening, sir. What is the surgical management of biliary obstruction in a setting of chronic calcific pancreatitis?
Well, it's very simple. It depends on what is the extent of the stricture. Sometimes the strictures are so long because of the extensive inflammation that the narrowing has gone right into the hepatoduodenal ligament. In such patients, only a combined hepatojejunostomy is the answer. So if you start your operation, in many cases, I find a choledochoduodenostomy is possible and is an excellent choice, especially if the duodenum is supple, because provided, of course, the bile duct is dilated. This allows you to not have the headache of organizing your jejunal loop, that it will cover the pancreas and cover the bile duct. Most people who do a combined anastomosis of the bile duct and the pancreas do not do a wide head coring. And if you do a wide head coring going to the inferior portion of the head, then try as you may, you still have serious problems in the lie of the jejunum. And you have to sometimes take a fairly long jejunal loop in order to achieve drainage of both. So if possible, I like to sneak in a choledochoduodenostomy. And in about 70 cases where we found that on the cholangiogram, the operation is commenced by cholangiogram, the catheter remains in the cystic duct, and you can repeat the study ad nauseum. You can actually mark out with a marker the extent of the stricture, and the stricture is only confined to the intrapancreatic portion. Please do your head coring, repeat the cholangiogram, and you find in many cases the dye flows freely into the duodenum. Then you do not have to add any other procedure, and so that's enough. Otherwise, you could even do an internal drainage.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Madeswaran.
Thank you.
I think in Hyderabad you get a lot of chronic pancreatitis. Doctor, Rashmi Kant is there. Dr. Rashmi, can you please unmute? Yes, logged out. Okay. Anybody who wanted to ask questions can ask now. If there are no more questions, we can wind up now. Thank you, H.RAMESH sir and Dr. Pradeep Rabella for accepting my invitation to Senadin Education Foundation for giving a talk and moderating this session, and the final words from both of you. I request you to give the final words from Dr. Rabella.
Yeah, I think what Ramesh has said is that we just has to learn a lot as we move along, because now the new concept of early intervention is coming in, of having good results now. We have data coming in now that early surgical intervention definitely has got good outcome. And then we are also moving in that direction. Now we are asking our endoscopists to refer these cases early before actually they become addicted to many of these narcotics. And our preliminary, it's unpublished data suggests that early intervention definitely my gut feeling is it preserves the pancreatic function as well. And though one of the oldest paper, as Ramesh has quoted as a Neelan's paper, has shown that though it is not supported by good evidence, but my feeling is that probably early intervention does preserve the pancreatic function.
So Bill Neelan's did show that there was benefit, isn't it?
Yeah, he showed there's a benefit.
Yeah, it's not rocket science that if you have the longer the disease, the greater the functional disability is quite appropriate.
Yeah, thank you, sirs. We can wind up. Thank all the participants who have logged from different parts of the world. There are a lot of logins from outside India also. Thank you for logging in. We'll meet once again, and I request Dr. H.RAMESH and Dr. Pradeep to give some more lectures in this forum. Thank you again for accepting my invitation.
Thank you.
Good night. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ramesh.
Good night, sir.
Good night.